welcome back everyone for the reaction video. I hope you are still doing okay and you are still safe at home. So for today we have two items on our agenda based on the two questions. The first one about the pro rata temporis principle in fixed term contract, and the second about the AKT decision of the Court of Justice. So let's start with the first. It's also the easiest one. Today I have received a little bit more reactions from your side. That's great. We're still not quite at 50% of reaction. I think we are around 40%. So let's just do a little bit more. So I will be very satisfied. So I have 4 different answers for the pro rata temporis, so you have chosen different ways to show the application of this principle. For instance, prior notice accumulation, so based on the time spent in the establishment, the payment of meal vouchers, daily meal vouchers, the holiday pay, and then paid sick leave. Okay, so of course all of these elements are potentially good answers, and I will explain why now in a second. And I don't want you to feel that you're trying to play some mind game where you have to read my mind to understand the right answer because I have thought of something and you have to find the same thing. So no, all these can be good answers, but I would say there are some which are a little bit closer to the principle of pro rata temporis, and my reason for this is the following. Some of these examples would be essentially identical for open-ended contract, okay, permanent contract. Let's say prior notice. So the example was, so you accumulate prior notice with your seniority. So if your contract only lasts for a month, of course your seniority maximum will be a month. But my answer would be, well, someone with an open-ended contract who is fired after a month, well, it has the same seniority as the fixed term contract example. So yes, it is based on the time spent in the company, so it is pro rata temporis, but I would say it is less linked to the fixed term nature of the contract. Okay. Another similar situation is for the paid sick leave, because you say you only have full claim to paid sick leave in a national situation after 6 months, and if your contract is shorter, then you don't get it. But the 6 months would be the same if you have like open-ended contract. You still need 6 months, so it's not very different. Although it is pro rata temporis, it is based on the time spent. Closer to home, I would say, are the examples of meal vouchers, because they are paid for each day you work for the company. You have the right of a lunch for each day you work. So of course, if you have a contract for less than a year, then you will have less than the amount of meal vouchers for each day of work. Fun fact, the example of one of your colleagues that sent in the answer was 231 days. It depends for each state how many days of work you have per year, of course. I believe mine are a little shorter. Well, I'm in France, you know. But this is a better, I'd say, example, because here you can see clearly the difference. If you have an open-ended contract, then you work the whole year normally, and you have a contract for 6 months, then you only will have meal vouchers for the day you have actually worked. Not exactly what I would have said, but again, not playing mind-reading games. Closer to home. And I would say even closer, the example of holiday pay. Because holiday pay is calculated on a yearly basis. And here you can really see the difference with the shorter contract. Because here, if you work 3 months, you will get your holiday pay, even if you don't cover the holiday period with your contract, but the amount will be based on the fraction of a year that you have worked. So in my mind, a good example of pro rata temporis must clearly show how this fraction comes into play. Okay. So my example, I have two, let's say. One, it's a little bit more complicated, but I will get the very easy one, is to have a contract for a week. Okay. Because when you think of fixed term, maybe you think of a 6-month contract, very classical, 6 months. But many fixed term contracts are much shorter. They can be 1 day, in fact, or like in my example, a week. So you have a contract for a week, and then you take the wage for normal wage, which is a month of full time, and you reduce it. You will have worked 5 days over 30 for a month, so it's a sixth, and here you are. Okay, so this is clearly fraction of a normal wage. Pro rata temporis. If you want to take a longer example, so you take a yearly thing, is for instance holidays, okay, annual leave. Even on a fixed term contract, you might have the right to annual leave. So in this case, let's say you work, let's say the easy example, 6 months. So you will have half of the annual leave you would have the right normally to. Let's say the minimum, the working time directive, which we have seen together, so you know perfectly well it's 4 weeks. You will have the right to 2 weeks of annual leave over your 6-month contract. Okay, so this is the idea. When you think in terms of pro rata temporis, you have to show me that there is a fraction somewhere that is applied. Okay, something that is normal amount, and then you have to divide by the actual time you have worked. Okay, this is what I had in mind, but still, all your answers were based on a calculation of the time spent at the company. I would just say that some were closer to the specificity of a fixed term contract. Now, coming to our decision, I will briefly summarize it because I also had 2 questions for clarification. One is general and one is on a specific paragraph. So the case, really in short, but it's also fun sometimes to try to summarize a case in as few words as possible. So the case, the situation is a collective bargaining agreement in Finland, actually 2, a national one and a sectoral one, which have an identical restriction to the use of temporary agency workers. And this restriction only allows these temporary agents, the use of temporary agency workers by a user undertaking in the case of first, peak of productions, peak of activity, or second, specific expertise which cannot be found inside the user undertaking. That's it. And this is the general agreement, and then a sectoral one in the tanker and oil sector in Finland, which has the same prohibition. Now, Article 4 of the Temporary Agency Workers Directive, you will see somewhere in the video, which is also mentioned by the court, says that these restrictions are only allowed in under specific justification, in particular for the protection of agency workers in terms of health and safety, or the protection of the labor market. Okay, so this is it. These are the justifications allowed. So the question is, these restrictions in Finnish law and collective agreements, are they compatible with the directive, first? And second, if they are not, can a national court disapply them in a dispute between private parties? This is it. This is the question. And in the end, the Court of Justice says that yes, they are compatible, and there is no such a right for national courts and tribunals to disapply national provisions if they go beyond what the directive allows in terms of restrictions to the use of temporary workers, temporary agency workers. Okay, so this is the decision, and my question was on a practical case. Imagine there is a country where trade unions and employers have signed a collective agreement which forbids the use of temporary agency workers in the cleaning sector because of a study that shows that they are more, they risk more accidents at work. They are a higher risk, which, by the way, it's true. So the question is this agreement compatible with the directive? And second, can a government extend the binding force of this agreement? And this was based on a true question, which a lawyer asked me some time ago when this kind of restriction was being considered in a collective agreement in Belgium. So it was a real concern. Question is there a risk with EU law? They wanted to know. Now you have given your answers. There are different ones to this question. Okay. Most of you have said yes, this can be done because you have seen that there is this possibility to justify restriction under health and safety of workers. But some of you have also said there might be a problem when the government extends the binding force. Second, there might be a problem with free movement of workers or freedom of establishment or freedom to provide services. Okay. And some others said, no, this is okay, health and safety. Some of you have also raised the concern about the problem of treating differently a specific sector as discriminatory. So I will try to address these concerns. So, of course, the answer, yes, you can do it, because health and safety, it's a good starting point, because yes, health and safety is at stake. So if you answer that to your client, let's say the government, or it might be the trade union or the employees association, they will be happy, at least in the beginning, because it's a clear answer, at least. But then one day there might be a problem and they will be less happy about that. Some of you have said there might be a problem indeed. Okay. And you're right in saying that the problem arises when the collective agreement is extended, because when it is not extended, what it does, it only binds the companies which have actually signed the agreement or which are members of the employers association. So for them, it's more difficult to invoke, for instance, the directive or the freedoms of the internal market, because they themselves have accepted these restrictions and they could free themselves of this. So you're right. The problem arises when this is extended. And luckily, we studied the UNIS case, so you had this idea that it changes something, the extension of the collective agreement. That's great. Very happy that you are learning something in our class. So yes, okay. Suppose we have extended this. Now there were two or three, let's say three more problems. The first one was the problem of proportionality. Some of you have raised a very, very correct concern about the fact that the study was general, but here we only forbid temporary agency workers in the cleaning sector. Okay, so the Court of Justice might say, if this was a general concern, the question of more accidents for temporary agency workers, why do you only prohibit this in the cleaning sector? And this might be a problem in the proportionality test at level of necessity, because you say it's not clear that if it is applicable in all sectors, why you only do it in one? Is it really necessary only in this? Okay, so it might be a problem, and we will see together when we study posting of workers, which will be our last class. We will see that the court sometimes has used this reasoning. If this is a general problem, you cannot justify to do it only in one sector. I would be less concerned about the difference in treatment of a specific sector, because when you use the concept of discrimination, you have not seen yet the first video of discrimination, and the second will be next week, so you are justified for this mistake. But when you speak of discrimination, you have to find a ground, a protected characteristic, let's say sex or race or age. And a sector is not a protected characteristic. So you can't treat differently different sectors. And now we come to the last problem, which is, of course, the question of the freedoms of the internal market. And you were right in thinking that this is where often the problems arise. Okay, so this is not only a problem with the directive on temporary agency work. Actually, if you take AKT, the decision I asked you to read, you might say it's a good decision for us if we want to justify this collective agreement. The court has said we can do this. Okay. But the court in AKT did not consider the question of the freedom of the internal market. And if you're curious about this, go read the opinion of the Advocate General. The opinion of Advocate General Spooner, sorry if my pronunciation is not correct, and this Advocate General really loves the freedoms of the internal market, so to speak, and he says, yes, this is fine under the directive, but there might be a problem under the rules of the internal market. So you're right in thinking this might be a problem. But the one of you which went a little bit further on this point said there is no cross-border element, so they cannot invoke these freedoms. You must always be very careful in this. Suppose you are giving advice to the government. There is no cross-border element right now, of course, but in the future there might be. It's not so difficult to find a cross-border element, in fact. And employers can also be very creative in finding one. Let's start from a real situation, so not something that has to be a little bit created. Let's say this collective agreement is concluded in Belgium, because again, you're supposedly studying at Liège at the moment. This is a collective agreement applicable in the whole territory of Belgium. Very well. So you are a cleaning undertaking company in Hasselt. Okay, and you want to use a temporary work agency which is established in Maastricht. Okay, and this is literally 25 minutes drive, and here you have it, your cross-border element. The temporary work agency in Maastricht will be able to invoke the freedom to provide services. So it's not too difficult to find a cross-border element, and sometimes employers try even harder. There has been a case, this is a case from the UK, where a railway company tried to argue that there was a cross-border element in a case. It was a case about the right to strike. So remember Viking, remember Laval, and they wanted to invoke Viking and Laval, of course. They wanted to, the employer, and the employer said, well, the railway company is owned, so it's a public company, it has shareholders, and it is owned by a French company. Okay, so the fact that the owner of the railway company is French means that there is a cross-border element. In the end, the English judge said, no, this is not the case. There is no cross-border element. This is not enough. But still, you can see how finding, or at least trying to find, a cross-border element is indeed not so difficult. As such, it is a good point, the one you raised about the freedoms of the internal market, but I would not be so quick in dismissing it as a concern, because it might indeed be relevant. And it could be much more difficult. We don't know from AKT what the answer of the court would be in such a situation, but it's probably more difficult, as you have learned in UNIS, more difficult to justify this restriction under the freedom of the internal market than under the directive on temporary work agencies. So, okay, these were the main concerns. There was another one which was a little bit different about the question of equal treatment. So the interpretation was, if this collective agreement excludes the cleaning sector, these might mean that they are also excluded from equal treatment, if I understood your answer correctly. And then you consider the situation under Article 5 on equal treatment, which allows for restrictions under collective agreements. And you said, well, this is a collective agreement, so it might be okay, but this general exclusion seems too much. Now, of course, this is a little bit different than what I was thinking, but again, no mind reading. And it's interesting. Can you have a collective agreement which excludes equal treatment in a sector? The answer, based on the directive, is yes. Yes, you can. But remember, the directive says that they should provide a globally comparable protection. So you might exclude equal treatment, but that doesn't mean that you could just, okay, the directive does not apply, you do whatever you want in this sector. Okay, so it's a correct concern to say that a general exclusion from equal treatment might be a problem in light of the directive. But remember that you could have this general restriction to equal treatment as long as you guarantee a sufficient protection to workers of temporary agencies. All right. So I think I have gone through. Let me check all your answers. Yeah, discrimination, the scientific study, and so on. Yes, the good point that some of you raised is that when extending the binding force of this collective agreement, the government should be really careful about this scientific study. About the fact that it's general, so maybe a scientific study specifically in the cleaning sector might be a better justification. So yes, this is a very good advice, and it was also very similar to what I've answered. That if, let's say, how you could formulate this advice, if social partners want to go forward with this agreement, they should do so, and the government could give the extension of the binding force, but the government should also be ready to defend it in front of the court and to use scientific data specific to that situation to fall into the health and safety justification. And by the way, when you give this kind of advice to governments, let's say, you should also keep in mind that governments change. So you can see very easily as government of a specific color, majority, could say, yes, I want to defend this. But then when the procedure in front of the Court of Justice arrives, you might have a different government. And the government might be against this restriction. And the procedure in front of the court could provide a very easy situation where you just don't defend it or defend it badly and you want to lose in front of the Court of Justice. And this can happen. And you as lawyers should be aware of legal strategies in this sense. So the advice to the government should also to remind them of this possible, let's say, ticking bomb for the future that they are setting up. Okay. So when preparing your legal argument, this is for government, of course, should also be taken into account that also political aspect might play a role in legal strategies. Okay, right. This should be all for today's reaction. Some of you in your answers have... Yeah, sorry, I was trying not to cough, so you don't immediately a word for me. I'm fine, thank you. So, about your answers, there was also a question for a clarification of paragraph 31. Let's see if I can find it very quickly. Okay, this is paragraph 31 of AKT. Some of you said, yeah, there's too many negatives in this paragraph to understand. So the meaning here is that Article 4 of the directive says that restrictions to the use of temporary work agencies are only allowed for specific reasons, which we have already said. What the code says is that this article only provides a need for member states to assess their legislation and to provide a justification for these restrictions, and does not create an obligation to enact new legislation to, for instance, cancel these restrictions. And based on this interpretation of the Court of Justice, why this is important, it's that because this article does not create an obligation for member state to do something, then parties cannot rely on this article to disapply national legislation. This was paragraph 30. Okay, that member states remain free to remove or justify this prohibition, and as such, you cannot draw a subjective right of, let's say, a temporary agency work, an undertaking, to use this article to disapply a restriction in national law. Okay, so the structure of paragraph 31 is a little bit complicated. So the Article 4 should be understood as only an obligation to assess and justify measures, and not as creating an obligation for member states to actually change their laws or to introduce new legislation. Right. Okay. So if you have more questions, really feel free to send them my way. If it is a specific question, I will only answer to you directly. Otherwise, I will include in my video. But do not, please, do not refrain from sending questions about what I explain in the videos. That's the idea. This time I did not have the time to answer all of you specifically to your email. I apologize for that. You were not forgotten. It's just that most of the points you raised were points that I could address in the video directly for everyone. So keep sending in your questions, keep sending in your answers. You have some nice cases to read for discrimination between men and women, the video which is supposed for tomorrow. It's already up on eCampus. So you can also watch it this evening if you want, if you're really bored at home. So all right, so keep staying safe, keep sending in your questions, and well, we'll see each other in the video of tomorrow, which I already recorded, so it's like a very difficult timeline, and next week for the reaction video. Bye.